Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our event here this afternoon on behalf of the PMO Community of Practice Chapter of Ireland. I'd just like to introduce our two presenters today, Terence O'Donnell, who is the Project and Consultant Partner and also of Auxilian, and also Director of the IT Alliance Group, and also Professor Joe Peppard, who's visiting us all the way over from Switzerland today, who's Professor and Academic Director of the Michael Murphy Business School of UCD. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Auxilian, who are actually sponsoring our event today, and also working with us on the actual event. Now, the PMO Pulse survey was in collaboration with the Ireland Chapter of PMI and the University of Limerick, the Centre for Project Management. And just to give you a quick intro, Terence has 35 years experience in project management, program management. He's a former professor of project management, and he's also been around in the business, and he's been involved with this survey over the last number of months. And Joe is also a professor at UCD, and he's a leading authority on digital change. So what I'd like to do is welcome you all today. Now I'd like to also welcome our friends from overseas who are with us today now. Welcome everybody, and if I pass over to Terence there, if that's okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark, and I'll just echo the welcome there, and I see there's still a few joining the call, so I'll let Joe speak for a second, and then I'll pick up the thread of the presentation. But the genesis of the survey really relates back to, you know, there are a number of well-known surveys, particularly PMO orientated, that have been doing the rounds for the last maybe 10, even 20 years. Those of you in the know would know that things like the PMO Solutions, KPMG, Wellington would be typically the reference points that I would use when I'm doing some research, particularly around the PMO area. But it struck me that we didn't have an Ireland Inc. version. And then on top of that, Joe and I have collaborated occasionally over the years on, and indeed the PMO. So I was one of the judges on the awards, the PMI Chapter Awards, a few years ago, and there was 2 or 3 really excellent PMOs that were shortlisted, and we did a lot of work in terms of working through those 3 companies in terms of pulling out some useful analysis and so on and so forth. And we also did some work on during COVID, right? And whether the PMO had any value, or was it worth its weight in gold, you know, when COVID hit. Again, we had some interesting feedback around that. So this was sort of a natural progression in terms of, let's have a look at it. Joe's also done some work previously. Joe, you want to talk about that as well, just to give a bit more context?
Yeah, sure, Terence. Yeah, I suppose my overarching interest is in the whole area of delivering, successful business outcomes from investment, particularly in technology, and obviously, ensuring that the investment that results is managed effectively, whether it's through a program or project, but also in the broad. And again, this is something that we will talk to later on in our talk this evening. The whole cycle from building the business case, making investment decisions, right the way through kind of resourcing, successfully executing on a project, to ultimately delivering on the business case and delivering the expected business outcomes. So I've got a kind of a broad interest, and obviously the PMO fits in there, and I from a personal interest is kind of get a sense of where actually does it fit. And I think we've got some interesting insights from the data that we've collected from the 114 organizations that have given us submissions.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that, we have a slide deck clearly, which is going to talk you through the sort of high-level results that have emerged. The survey was open for about 3 weeks. I think we were a little bit tongue-in-cheek when we suggested it would take 5 to 10 minutes to complete. We're delighted with the response. So there's 114, not necessarily all from a separate organisation. I'm sure that there's some duplicates in there as part of that whole process. There was 30 odd questions involved. One of the questions at the end I'm going to mention now, we're going to do somewhat detailed, deep analysis in the next few months, but we said we would share the sort of headlines in terms of the immediate results of the questions, or at least most of them, on this call. There's one or two areas that we'll delve into a little bit more in terms of some discussion. Joe has a particular interest in terms of benefits and benefits realisation, benefits management. There was one question we asked around that, and also, the topic of AI. And I know there's a few colleagues on the call who are quite interested in terms of what emerged in that conversation. So Joe will probably pick up on those 2 points. There's a couple of others that I want to talk a little bit more about in terms of the performance of the PMO and the perception of that, particularly the performance as perceived by, let's call them senior management or the users of the service. So we've done a little bit of filtering, not an awful lot, but a little bit of filtering in terms of, well, how good is the PMO performing according to those who use it versus how good the PMO is performing by those who are providing the service, because it can be a little tilted, for want of a better term. And then aside from that, we'll just give you sort of, here's the raw data percentage-wise, which may or not be interesting. At the end of this whole process, through the community of practice that Mark's looking after, there will be a glossy, right, which will have a detailed analysis of all of the material, charts and processes and so on and so forth. I'll use it for my academic leadings, but it also might lay the groundwork for a similar survey being done every couple of years, if it takes root. Would you please use the chat? Mark's going to keep an eye on the chat. One, for two reasons. One is any questions. We'll through the process. There'll be time for questions at the end. I may tell you up front, we haven't done a huge amount of filtering yet. This is so you might be asking some questions, which would, we might use that questions to actually take them on in terms of the next piece of analysis. So I'm a pointy head when it comes to this stuff, as is Joe a little bit in the research. So I'm going to love the rest of my summer. I know, sad person that I am, because now I've got lots of data to go after as part of this whole process. So the fact that we got that much of a response is brilliant. We're pleased with it. But this is just the first of the series of things we're going to do. There'll probably also be, a more face-to-face towards the end of the year. And as I said, there was one question we did ask those who participate in the survey who have, expertise in the area, for one reason or another, if they'd like to get involved in some roundtable discussions and some deeper discussions which will come from this. If there are those on the call who want to get involved in that, just leave your email address in the chat and we'll pick that up then as well as part of the process. So I'm going to suggest I'll just walk through some of the demographic stuff and just go through the facts that emerged in terms of the survey itself, and then we'll get into some of the questions in a little more depth. Joe will pop in when we get to the two areas that he's got particular interest in, that he's done analysis on, and I'll pop up back later on. But in terms of the research, Mark's already mentioned, we leveraged the chapter. So the chapter sent out notifications, emails, and I used my old alma mater, and I got the Centre for Project Management to push out similar invites, and I used my own network as part of it. So there was an awful lot of pushing to get people to respond to this, which is great. So first slide, one of the very first questions we asked was for people's job titles, right? So you can see this is going to be a significant lever point in terms of filtering when we take a look at the responses in some detail. But as you can see there, all familiar titles. A quarter of the folks who responded were actually PMO directors or the head of PMOs. And then you had a mix of, senior project managers, program managers, portfolio and managers or directors then. about a quarter then was the others. Others would have been, general managers and specialist roles as part of the whole process. But we're quite happy that those who responded, were positionally in the right place in terms of their expertise. Okay, so pretty broad but significant in terms of the roles and the responsibilities that each of them had. As for the organisation headcount, we got a little surprised when I saw this. I didn't expect this, right? So the most popular or the most dominant organizational headcount trend was actually a quarter of the respondents belong to organizations that are 10,000 plus, right? Now, I did some analysis before the call, and that's dominated by manufacturing was number 1, followed closely by construction engineering number 2, telecoms and ICT number 3, and healthcare. So those 4 sort of made up that very large number, which was and it also would be no surprise that one of the questions we asked later on was how many PMOs is there in the organization, right? So the higher the number of employees, the more dominant there was, the multiple PMOs came in. Somebody even said hundreds. I didn't quite believe that, but that's that was the mindset, right? So quite a decent spread, not an awful lot below 100. So only about 12% that had 100 people or less, right? So again, it goes to the point that PMOs might be seen as a luxury, right? And for larger organizations, and maybe not so much on the SME space. Again, no surprise. The third one then was the breakdown of the sectors, right? Again, a good spread. No single sector exceeded 50%, right? So construction engineering slightly ahead, and then you had the financial. And then there's 2 categories, which is IT and telecoms and ICT, which between the 2 of them made up 20%. Healthcare, again, as I mentioned previously, there was a lot of interest and a lot of people from the healthcare area to respond. And again, manufacturing, which I had expected to see as part of that response, but well diversified. And as I said, no dominant sector which would skew that. But again, what we'll be able to do at some point, we'll be able to filter and anchor each sector and do some more in-depth analysis in terms of the responses. Head offices, right? So we did set out, to make an Ireland Inc. dimension on this. In other words, we're very interested in the Irish broad definition of Irish PMO landscape. Okay, so about 3/4 of those responded, were based in Ireland, right? There's the one you don't see at the bottom there. There's 3% from Northern Ireland, right? So, and 25% others. Others spread, quite a few from New York, right? Quite a few there was 2 or 3 from Paris, right? Speckled across Europe, right? So no sort of dominance in any particular country, but the US was probably one of the more dominant ones out of that bracket. Again, we will be filtering and anchoring responses, based on the geographies I just mentioned there as part of the process. We did ask the question, which is the popular one. There's 2 or 3 very popular questions. Most surveys will have them, and the work pattern was the obvious question to ask. And the options were here. Look, does your PMO work fully on-site, fully remote, hybrid mostly on-site, or hybrid mostly remote? And no real surprise that the hybrid mostly remote dominated that a little bit. Although hybrid with the on-site option, you can see there's 39% was actually quite high as well. Fully on-site, only 3%, right? Again, some initial filtering on that. The heavy industry, the engineering construction folks, they're more in the hybrid, mostly on-site. A lot of the IT folks were hybrid, mostly remote. I think it's the nature of the workload, the virtual teams and so on and so forth. There's obviously a connection there as part of that whole process. And then the positioning of the PMO, right? So one of the things that I did years ago, I was lucky enough, I was involved in, and I was responsible for setting up the first PM national conference back 25 years ago. And the first topic that we did, believe it or not, was PMOs, right? And at the time, it was a fledgling, specialty. But one of the things that people keep going back to is, well, what level does the PMO operate at? Is it there for efficiency? Is it there to deliver projects better? Is it there to add value? Is it there to provide, business leverage in terms of a portfolio of work to deliver X, Y, and Z, et cetera, et cetera. So this particular question was really trying to understand, where does it sit? It's complicated in the sense that in larger organizations, there are quite a number of PMOs, and multiples will be sitting at different levels, okay? But in terms of the broadness of the question, most PMOs, in this case, sat at the portfolio level, right? Which means there are multiple initiatives, either multiple programs, divisional oriented work, and so on and so forth. And you can see the enterprise PMO, which is corporate wide, again, quite popular, but they're pretty even, right? So you've got lots of focus on project, program, enterprise, but portfolio was the mainstay that came back in terms of more popular. When they were established, right, again, PMOs have not been around that long, right? I'm just getting a bit senile in my own point. So I've always thought they've been around forever, but there's quite a lot of folks who respond have that the PMOs that they have are less than about half or about less than 10 years old. When I had a conversation with Joe earlier in the week, he said, well, that's hardly surprised. It's been, I said they're still quite a young entity, but they've been around for quite longer in say construction engineering more so than others, But a lot of them are as I said, the history there is sort of 10 years is the average, One of the questions I was quite anxious to understand myself is this one, right? Does the PMO operate under a formally approved project charter or terms of reference? In other words, is it set up for a particular purpose? Was that designed and was that signed off? And is there a sort of a contractual, dimension to it? 60% yes, 40% no. We asked some questions behind that. Again, we have to do some more analysis on it in terms of why that's the case and how fluid it is. Because quite often PMOs, in a particular version of it, most of them tend to last about 18 months. And then they have to transform and move to the next level because of the nature of the company and what's required and so on and so forth. So not having a charter is sometimes quite it's a sign that, there's a fluidity there, and what does good look like becomes quite difficult at that point, So we will be getting into this one in a lot more detail. And then reporting lines, right? So you can see here quite a few of the PMOs in the survey in terms of the feedback actually reported to the CEO, right? Which, in the project management nirvana world, a lot of people would always have a mind, we're getting there when the project and the project management office is at the top of the totem pole in the context of reporting to the senior management team, right? We can have a long conversation about that, but in this case, there's a significant number of the PMOs that were straight in to the CEO. No surprise, in my opinion, to see the likes of the CFO and the COO in there as a dominant piece. Indeed, as you see the CIO in there. COO efficiency, CIO, you're looking at transformation projects, change management, all that sort of stuff, which would be typically associated with the CIO, CTO stuff, and then the CFO very much around cost reduction and so on and so forth. And there's quite a lot of others, as you can see there, but no real surprises. And the level of the PMO then ties back to where they report into the organization. Yeah, how the PMOs were organized we asked a couple of questions around this one, right? So again, in larger organizations, you know, that you have this concept of a centralized, you know, PMO who effectively sets the rules, the standards, and it becomes the mainstay of how projects are actually delivered within an organization. But you then have a situation, you know, in lots of larger companies where that we call that a hub and spoke. So in other words, we have a central core, but then you have satellite PMOs that might specialize in, you know, a certain engineering division, or specialize in an IT world, right? Or specialize in business development, right? But they all have a commonality back to, here's our standards. So things like methodologies, best practice, rules and techniques and cabs will all be held centrally. So central was by far the biggest, but then there's a fairly even split between, as I say, that hub and spoke, which was a centralized core with satellites, or then fully embedded decentralized units. So in other words, the PMOs were built in and knitted into each of the business areas. Okay. Again, rich data for us to go after. So there'll be no surprise. We asked the question also then, what KPIs are tracked by the PMO, right? And all the usual suspects, you know, the iron triangle or the triple constraints world that we've talked about for years is still there. The top three, they look at schedules, they look at budgets, look at scope, risk, resource utilization, and benefits, right? And then there's a bit of a drop off after that, you know. I thought things may have changed somewhat, but the usual suspects feature heavily. And then from an oversight perspective, we did ask the question, look, in your organization and in the PMO, does the PMO look after all projects? Is it a mixture? Or is it projects that exceed a certain thresholds? Or in other words, is there a reference point against which there's a decision taken that needs an oversight? And there's a real spread here, right? Some organizations, you know, focus on everything. Others have got a mix, right? Several criteria, you know, anything over 500,000 becomes part of what the PMO looks like. Others have different thresholds and so on and so forth. So again, we'll be going after this one in a little more detail to try and understand, you know, how does that, the correlation work in terms of some of the things that are there. Now, I'll stop talking for a little minute and I'll hand over to Joe, who's going to take you through the next 10 minutes or so in terms of the benefits world and also AI. So Joe, once you want me to move forward the slide, just say Terence and I'll move forward for you.
Thank you, Terence. Yeah, again, you know, obviously at the end of the day, particularly, again, I'm coming at this, you know, the PMO projects, programs from a kind of a technology, digital perspective. So companies are making investments, I'm assuming in digital of all sorts in order to deliver, you know, business outcomes, deliver, you know, effectively deliver benefits. So we were sort of interested as to whether the kind of the PMO would sort of track benefits and actually have a, you know, a kind of a register. And again, on that slide, you can see the kind of the statistics there. And again, which maybe is a little bit surprising, that you know, 65% say no, and you know, and that's kind of, you know, the previous slide when you looked at the kind of the KPIs, again, you know, primarily it's tracking cost, you know, resource utilization and scope, and surprisingly less attention given to the benefits, which is something that I think bears out in my experience, unfortunately, as well. Terence, if you can go on to the next slide, please. So again, one of the questions which you're probably all interested in is actually, what do these PMOs do? So we looked at 114. I think actually we only really had usable data from 113, but you can kind of get a sense of what do PMOs do, and so we've got absolute numbers and also the kind of the percentages. And Terence, if you just move on, just to kind of just illustrate, just there is kind of a, you know, a kind of a primary focus, which again goes back to the KPIs that we were reported that were tracked. So again, the majority of the PMOs in the study, essentially providing admin and secretarial support for particularly for supporting kind of relevant kind of governance meetings, whatever type of meetings they were, perhaps maybe a steering committee, for example, collating reports, maintaining, project management methodologies, tracking cost and resource utilization. So this was the kind of the primary focus, and then there was a whole bunch of other things. We kind of asked the respondents to let us know if their PMO did that, but again, less of them actually did. So this was the dominant area, and just to kind of maybe add a little bit of richness and explanation, Terence, if you can go on to the next slide. And this is a framework that myself and Terence developed a number of years ago, again as a result of some research that we were doing, and what we're trying to do here is really to look at the full, so let's say, life cycle of a business case, an investment proposal, taking it through the actual selection of a particular investment, where it's given the kind of the go ahead, to the actual execution of that, but also taking into consideration capacity management, managing resources, also building capability within the organization, delivering on projects, and then optimizing the overall portfolio of investments. And this is sort of a framework that we kind of developed that tries to capture all of that. And what it does is, on one of the axes, the bottom axis, you can see we're sort of mapping out the kind of the orientation. So making that distinction between the how on the supply side, and the demand on the what, and then the focus, whether it's kind of strategic or operational, and this enabled us to identify what we kind of refer to as value realization domains. So the domain of kind of investment execution, which we'll see in a moment, is really all about running the projects and programs in a way that they are successfully executed. So we're talking about methodologies. We're talking about ensuring kind of consistency and sort of predictability in terms of running our investments. And then we have then obviously the resource orchestration, which is all about capacity management, allocating resources across the different projects and programs in the portfolio. The outcome realization is concerned with ensuring that the expected business outcomes and the benefits are actually delivered. And then the kind of the portfolio optimization, covers everything from the kind of selection of the investment right the way through to kind of optimizing the return from the overall portfolio of investments. And so what I've done here is, from the previous question where we were looking at, what do these 113 PMOs actually do, I've sort of positioned what the respondents were telling us. And again, you can just sort of see that, most of the activity is in the investment execution. And you can see that by, the pretty large percentage. And again, the numbers there are actual percentages. When we go to outcome realization, again, you might be a little bit concerned that, for example, supporting benefit realization was, only kind of 34%, for example. Again, a small number of PMOs conducting project health checks, for example, or post-project reviews and lessons learned as well was, just about half. And for me, that's pretty interesting, because I know many years ago I did some research, and what we found was got a high correlation between organizations that do conduct project reviews, do lessons learned, and success. So there seems to be a very, very strong correlation between organizations that do that activity and successful business outcomes. Again, when we look at resource orchestration, so this is everything from capacity management, building capability within the organization to successfully, run projects and programs, and also, allocate resources across the portfolio of projects and programs. And then we can see then the kind of the activities around the overall portfolio optimization. And again, And again, as Terence has mentioned, we are going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a lot of the data that we've collected. But I'm not too concerned, for example, that, let's say, identification, selection, and prioritizing new projects or programs, the low percentage, because on the one hand, should a PMO actually be doing that anyway? Perhaps in the other, 60% plus organizations, this activity was being undertaken by the leadership team, which you probably would expect. So, despite this framework being used, for the full sort of life cycle of an investment, the fact that the PMO is not doing activities in some of the quadrants, to me anyway, would not be an area of concern if those activities are actually being done elsewhere. Do you want to move on, Terence?
Yeah.
To the next slide. Yeah, obviously AI, everybody's interested in AI. So we did pose a question in relation to whether or not respondent organizations were actually using AI tools, and that gives you the kind of the data. 70% weren't, 30% were. They said they were. So again, we just have a little bit of data here in terms of, you move on to the next slide. Where for a couple of comments, first of all, before we kind of dig into the data, where the label AI was used, it was generally used in a general sense. Occasionally, respondents mentioned Gen AI, and I kind of get the sense from reading between the lines that most, when they talk about AI usage, we're actually referring to Gen AI. There was no mention whatsoever of machine learning, although I would suspect that possibly for some of the data analysis, it was actually machine learning that was being used. One respondent did mention a particular, use, of a tool. So again, they talked about AI for all. I wasn't too sure if that was a specific PM tool or whether it was a specific tool that they had developed internally themselves. And there was one respondent, and I think it's something that myself and Terence would like to explore, where they said they were using AI for everything, from proposal, scope, process, analytics, research, financial analysis, sales plans, forecasting, administration. Which again, as you can imagine, that would be an interesting organization to study. In terms of when we dig into the data, there was quite a number made reference to Copilot, mostly Microsoft. So there was kind of 10 mentions of the 114. But that doesn't mean that others weren't using it. My sense is, when I looked at the responses in relation to how AI was being used for example, for taking notes of meetings, to summarizing and preparing minutes, for example, I kind of get the sense a lot of people are using, let's say Teams as a platform. Again, given what the data that we saw in terms of remote working, I would imagine a lot of meetings are held online, and the Copilot is used to both record, and also to summarize the meeting. So that's how it's being used. Again, a number mentioned the use of AI for drafting and rewriting documents, everything from drafting letters to assisting, writing charters and scope statements. Again, so it was a small number, and then, as I said, that was probably the bulk. And then a very, very small number. We're talking about, low single digits, around knowledge management. And personally, this is where I think, maybe Gen AI is really going to have an impact into the future. In the 90s, knowledge management was a big area of interest, but it never really took off. And I think maybe Gen AI could be, the fuel that really helps it there. So again, that was mentioned on a number of occasions. And then again, very low single digits, 2 or 3 mentioning using AI for data analysis and reporting. And then I think, there was one respondent that mentioned using AI for preparing bid responses.
Yeah.
Although I sort of wasn't sure exactly how that fits into let's say managing projects and programs, unless one of the remits of the PMO is actually to respond to requests for proposals. So I'll hand back to you, Terence.
I think the other thing we might share, Joe, is when we got this large data set, I thought, God, it'd be useful to see what AI makes of it, because it's very good at crunching all large data. And we were surprised to find that it wasn't very accurate when it went to do the analysis, especially when it went to filtering. And it made up a few comments all by itself. So we ended up going back to the Excel spreadsheet and look at the raw data and pull it out, because we couldn't trust it. Okay.
Yeah, that's a fair point, because so the closing date for the survey was I think it was Monday. So I think Tuesday or Wednesday, Terence did actually say, well, let's use AI just to get a sense of the data, what it's kind of suggesting before we sort of put together our material. And over the weekend, when I was putting together this some of these slides, I texted Terence and I said, Terence, the data that the AI was telling us is totally wrong. It's even making up quotes. Yeah, so it's a cautionary tale.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time. So let me see. Yeah, another few questions just to round it off. We did ask the question around certification. Now, the question that was posed was, what percentage of PMO staff hold at least one recognised PM certification? So again, the numbers there speak for themselves. It's no surprise that certification will be important. One of my clients put it quite well a few months ago when we talked about this topic. They like to have multiple certifications, not just PMI, not just PMP, not just the APM world, around a set of experienced and accredited people tend to be better in that broad context. But you can see there, like most of the organizations seem to value certification and that broader sense of the word, with 20% they're the top, of the organizations having multiple certifications. But again, certifications important is the takeaway on that one, and most organizations seem to value it. Now, moving on a little bit in terms of, we did ask a number of questions about the PMO performance, okay? And one question which is kind of related to the question that we mentioned earlier, the question around, does the PMO have a formal charter, or does the PMO have a formal terms of reference? This is sort of tied to that question somewhat, which is, how often does the PMO formally collect and report feedback on its performance? Your Likert scale, whatever it is. Of some immature organizations, where likely what the PMO's role is, where they're taking it, and then are ad hoc. So over half of the PMOs are either ad hoc or never ask for feedback, right? You'd expect, from me, annually minimum, but you can see they're monthly, quarterly, annually. So that's the other part of it. So I'm not very surprised about that, and this is because of my own experience with work with PMOs for years. But it does go, well, what does good look like? What are you trying to achieve? What does the business expect the PMO, and how are you reporting on it? I could speak for another 2 hours on that particular slide, but it's a reference point. Message takeaway is, a lot of the PMOs either are ad hoc or don't ask for, and they don't measure it. The satisfaction point, we did ask a couple of questions around how satisfied people were with their PMO, and we looked at it through 2 angles. One angle was, how satisfied were the senior business executives with the PMO overall? In other words, primarily users or senior management in terms of those that, and again, you can see there, somewhat satisfied was the largest one, right? And some are indeed very satisfied as part of that process, okay? Now, everybody responded to this, whether they were a senior manager or, a smaller cog in that wheel. So I did do a little bit of filtering on this one, right? So what I did was I filtered out, you know, the users of the system. In other words, these were people who responded who primarily used the service of the PMO, as opposed to they were part of the PMO service, you know. And again, I'm not surprised about this. There was a drop in satisfaction then, right? So the senior management, or those who use the service dominantly, there was a notable drop in terms of their satisfaction levels, right? And a little bit more were somewhat dissatisfied compared to the general population, for a better term. And then we did ask a question around, you know, how is the PMO perceived within the organization? Okay, and dominantly, you know, is it it's looked as a control center, because a lot of PMOs either provide support or control, or they're an organizational development unit. But control would tend to be, you know, where management are very anxious to get efficiencies, right, and predictability and so on and so forth, and cost management. So about a quarter focus on that, and that's the perception. Very small number of them we're looking at the PMO as a strategic unit. Now, again, one of Joe's areas is value management, right? Not value management in the engineering sense, but value management from an organization point of view. And that strategic unit, you know, sometimes differentiates one of those quadrants I talked about earlier. A lot of people were unsure, and that tells you, you know, back to a point. Well, what does the PMO do? What's it good at? How does it measure? And then the people had sort of a mix of both, right? There was an open text question around this one, right? Again, I've delved into it, but some interesting comments. And we had one or two people who actually said the PMO was pointless, right? So not everybody's happy with their PMOs, for a better term. Again, here, filtered by senior management. So I'll filter this one, right, by looking at what does senior management think, you know, in terms of performance-wise, you know. So half of the executive sponsors, you know, or those who reporting lines have a mixed or ambivalent view, you know, in terms of what the PMO and the value of it is, you know. And again, Joe, this goes back to the conversation we had earlier in the week, where, you know, sometimes you find that the management are more unhappy or dissatisfied, you know, on how well projects are run, because the PMO has actually told them that. And you want to maybe comment on that, because it's kind of an odd point that pops up every so often. And the final thing then, right, we asked, you know, broadly speaking, how satisfied the staff are with the overall PMO. And you can see here, different type of scale, right? But generally speaking, and it's not surprising, because most of the folks, as you saw in the beginning of the survey, in terms of the roles and so on and so forth, that people are generally either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. So you can see the mean there in terms of that scale. There's not that many who are, you know, dissatisfied, either very or somewhat, you know. So turkeys aren't voting for Christmas here, for want of a better sense. And that's broadly speaking, the sort of the one of the last questions. The one I've left at the end, and it's sort of linked back to the start of the conversation, Mark, which was, look, communities of practice, right? So one of the things that people tend to push when they're pushing the agenda, in the best sense of the word, the drugs of project management, whether it's PMO oriented or not, is the idea of a community of practice, you know, or coaching schemes, or, you know, that career development piece. We asked the question, you know, does your PMO, or does the organization, broadly speaking, have a community of practice, or that broader coaching dimension? And only 31% of the organizations, and there were significant organizations in there, have that, you know. So in terms of developing the profession, developing the skill sets, and so on and so forth, again, kudos to the chapter. You know, that community of practice is part of what you know, we're trying to do here, and there's clearly work to be done in terms of establishing that, or having the credibility to actually move that forward. And I think that's my last slide, and I'm not too bad on time. I know there's probably some questions, so on and so forth, but I've reached my veil now, and I'll hand back to Mark to close things out.
Yeah, thanks, Terence. Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. Very interesting. Some of the responses there, and I'm sure you'll get some more detail on those. I had a question there, and I've got a couple of questions here. But what I'll do is I'll actually ask the attendees first, and then we'll see if we can. We'll go through those first, and then if we can come to mind at the end, if needs be. If not, we can share them afterwards. And so, I mean, the first question there was from Gerard. He's just asking around the curious to know the average age of the PMOs. I know you put up a slide there of all the different ones, so I'm sure you can work it out, can't you? Or you can give the information later.
Yeah, I'm happy to circulate the slides, Mark. Actually, they're on notes. So, and as I said, down the line, we will be drilling into all of these questions and some detail, and then cross correlating and so on and so forth. But I'm still a little bit surprised, Joe, that the length of time the PMOs are in play, quite a lot of them are 10 years or less. I was expecting a bit more maturity, but then again, I'm old now.
And thanks, Jeremy. There's another question around the survey findings, which Martha asked around should PMOs focus their development over, where should PMOs focus their development over the next few years? I mean, and I assume that's probably going to come out of your deeper dive, I'd say, before you actually are able to answer that straightforward.
If I can give a kind of a response, and sure, you're correct, Mark. Yeah, I think one of the latter slides that Terence presented talked about, how the PMO is perceived within the organization, which I think might give a glimpse of that, because what we're going to look at is we're going to see, is that defined by what it does? So if we kind of look at, we find, that, for example, that, respondents are really very, very happy, very satisfied with the PMO. Are those PMOs doing certain things that, let's say, a PMO that there's less satisfaction with?
Yeah.
So is there correlation between satisfaction levels and what the PMO actually does?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I've gone back to the domain slide, Joe, because a lot of PMOs in the early days tend to focus on that investment execution, over efficiency, right? Cost management, on time, on budget. But a lot of the PMOs, when they develop and become a much more integrated part of the business, they move much more up into the strategic side. Now, that might be a separate PMO, right? Or they help either define and indeed deliver the portfolio. That's a much more strategic piece. So that question, Martha, is also tied to where does the business need support? Where the PMO can actually can help.
Yeah, and I think just if I can add to that, Mark, that the whole idea of this framework and why we've sort of just kind of pulled it apart a little bit is we didn't want to give this the suggestion or to leave people with the impression that actually, with a lot of kind of these 2x2s, it's about getting to the top the top right hand quadrant. This is not a framework that's like that. It's kind of positioning these sort of domains. So as to Terence's point, a lot of PMOs focus on the investment execution. Yeah, so running projects following a particular approach, a particular methodology. You're looking for consistency, or you're looking for predictability, okay? But there may be a problem that this organization is doing the wrong projects, for example, or it's doing projects that actually have no possibility of delivering expected business outcome, the outcomes that are expected. So that means that actually, that it goes back to the business case process where, again, I'm going back to research that I've done over the years where, in some companies, the business case process is a game, and if I can sort of prove that my investment proposal is going to deliver more than somebody else's, I get it approved. In other companies, it's seen as accountant's torture. So there's different, so if you're selecting the wrong investments, no matter how good your delivery is, you're not going to deliver the outcomes that you're expecting because possibly they're unachievable.
Thanks. And probably another question for you, Joe, just from Declan here. He asked how any thoughts on how PMOs should balance experimentation with AI to measurable business value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, we were a little bit surprised that there wasn't more use of AI. But then on the other hand, you might think, well, actually, this is the reality because there's a lot of hype around AI. I think it's, there are, again, there are certain activities that open themselves up for, potential use, particularly of Gen AI. There, and we know, again, myself and Terence, from previous research that we've done, that some companies have been using machine learning for quite a while, before this current interest in Gen AI. So yeah, I think it is about doing that, the piloting, the experimentation to find those opportunities. And as you saw from the data, those that are using it really are using it because they probably are using a platform like Teams or Zoom to run meetings, whether they're steering committee meetings or project meetings, and then just summarize, using the technology to summarize the meeting, to produce the minutes for the next meeting, maybe the action plans.
That's my experience actually in our organisation anyway. They're mostly used for that now, and in the future now we're looking at from a PPM tool point of view as well. But that's in the future.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I fully expect what I would call project admin and project support activities, whether it's scheduling, integration of time costs from different solutions, to generate, status reports and updates. That'll be done by AI. There's not a question in my mind around that stuff. Now, the problem is, as we've all found, and myself and Joe on this one, I don't trust it right now. So there's a way to go. And I know, Declan, this is your area. So once you come up with someone that actually, I believe it, right? And some of the stories I've heard in the last few weeks would make your hair stand on. People are just trusted. It's not quite there yet, but I absolutely see what I would call the project support service being a bot of some description. It's just controlling the bot.
And Declan's our expert. If any questions around that, Declan Foster's our expert there, and he'll be able to help you on that now and in the future. And just to plug the Ireland Chapter of PMI, Declan is he's involved with the hub there, the AI hub. So you can see us on the website there as well, and you can connect with him and talk to him about any of those questions there as well. Just a couple more questions here now. One around from Paul here around. He's just saying it's interesting that value benefits is a relatively less common KPI. And any data on what's actually been done?
Yeah, Joe, I know you're going to speak to this one, but I recall an event I spoke at maybe 10 or 12 years ago. It was a project management event, mainly PMs in the room or those close to that fraternity. And the question I asked was, how many people here use risk logs? Right? And there's almost 100% of hands went up. And I asked the question, how many people here use benefits and benefits logs, right? Or realization? 2 people with their hands up, right? So this idea of on time, on budget, and focus on outputs of projects, it's just sort of ingrained in lots of people. But one of my favorite phrases is on time, on budget, wrong outcome. Right. And for that, you actually don't understand what you're trying to do here. What are the benefits, how you're measuring them? And lots of those benefits aren't accrued to the organization until much later and much longer after the project is closed, So there's a huge issue around that. And Joe, I know this is one of your favorite topics. You want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think that, and it's something that I've been banging on at, successfully delivering in a project or program does not equate with delivering in the benefits and value. And again, we sort of see that from the metrics that are tracked, and it's not just from this survey, it's from lots and lots of other research and also experience that the measures that are tracked are on time, to budget, and scope, in the sense of is it doing what it what we expect, what it says on the tin, and the assumption still is that if those criteria are met, therefore, the benefits that are being articulated in the business case will, be automatically delivered. And, in economics, economists talk about the invisible hand. In technology, there is no invisible hand. Those benefits have to be actively managed for, and it's really, the reality is that, once the project sort of, again, I'm thinking about IT systems in particular, once essentially, the system sort of goes live, the project maybe comes to a natural end, victory is declared, everybody goes off happy, and then, the actual then what happens then in terms of the benefits realization, that's not really carried through. And I think that is a big issue. And I know the CEO of PMI, I just saw that he was, it seemed to be a revelation for him, was it earlier on this year, when he talked about, the focus on outcomes. Well, actually, we've been, talking about, outcomes for decades. And actually, if I can, maybe suggest that actually the PMI have actually probably been holding the world back in terms of, the methodologies that, at the end of the day, companies are making investments. And again, I'm talking specifically about technology and digital and data to deliver, business outcomes. And we know from the data, in terms of, project success and it's still incredibly low.
Thanks very much, sir. I suppose we're just coming to the end here, so there's a couple more questions that I probably won't go through at the moment now, but as we said, we'll take these away now, and we can look at them, and we can come back. And I suppose, as Terence and Joe both said, the plan is to actually have a hands-on or in-person event in the future to discuss this further. So I'd just like to thank Terence and Joe today now for presenting their findings. I'd also like to thank Mariana and Antoinette for in the background working their systems and making sure everything went smoothly. Just so you know, we have an in-person event which I hoped in October, so we hope to have that in October again. And so what we'll do at that point, we'll keep an eye on the PMI website and the events there, and that'll come up there, and you better give it enter that event there at that time. Also, one other thing just to plug while we're here is PMI, and Terence mentioned it. We have our awards, the Ireland Chapter of PMI Awards event coming up on the 6th November. And the submission for the closing date for the actual submissions for those awards is on the 8th of August. And that's so again, look on the website there for the events. I'll drop in the link after I finished here for the actual to apply for that. Just a couple of housekeeping things here. The PDO code there is came up on the in the text box if you need it there. And I'd just like to thank Auxilian, our sponsors of the PMO Community of Practice for the Ireland chapter, and again, Joe and Terence for today. And we look forward to seeing you soon in person, discuss these very interesting findings further. Thanks very much, everybody. Good evening.